And we are live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever in the heck in the world you are. It is Thursday. It is 12 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time in New York. And you know what time it is. It is none other than time for the one and only Harley Schlanger to join us and to break down the entire geopolitical events as they are happening real time. With that being said, Harley, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine. How are you, V?
I'm doing great, man. I mean, where do you want to start this on?
Boy, there's so much going on, but I just got a very interesting report that I think is worth looking at
Hmm,
on the Manchester attack, Manchester, England.
sure.
Réseau Voltaire, which I think you're familiar with, Thierry Maison,
Yes.
has an article saying that the father of the alleged terrorist, this guy Salman Abedi, the father is an MI6 agent who was deployed by the Brits into the anti-Gaddafi movement. He's a Libyan who was deployed by the Brits into the anti-Gaddafi movement. Supposedly, he was anti-ISIS, but he worked with something called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was Al Qaeda in Libya.
Hmm.
So here you have a connection of British intelligence to the massacre which took place in Manchester. And you think about the timing of it right before the NATO summit, the time that Trump is in the Middle East, and with all the problems I have with him kissing up to the Saudis, there was an effort made by Trump to put forward some different strategic perspective.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, you have the moves coming out of various networks to undermine the success of the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative from China. The most recent being the German ambassador to India holding a press conference right before Modi comes to meet with Merkel, saying that the Indian government should stay away from the Chinese Silk Road policy because it's designed only to aid China, that it's a phony initiative and it's going to hurt India.
Hmm.
So you can see a sharpening of the tension between the two new paradigm, or the new paradigm and the old paradigm.
Hmm. No, wait.
But
Merkel said this or Modi?
the German ambassador to
Oh,
India.
okay. Right. Okay.
But I mean, basically, that's the German outlook. The Germans sent someone to the Beijing conference who was negative. The only one from any country that went there and said, this is no good, this is not going to work, it's not transparent enough. As though Germany's been transparent with. The Germans are playing a terrible role. Today, just down the street from where I am right now, Merkel and Obama are going to have a love fest in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Now, it's hard to know which of the two of them is the man in the relationship, or who wears the pants, we should say.
Right.
But this is, an example of the deep state and all its networks deploying all out to protect the collapsing paradigm from the emergence of the new paradigm. So I think this is quite significant. Now, just one other note, this is another thing that just came across my desk on the various operations of the anti-Trump movement. It's now been reported that George Soros, who is one of the authors of the original idea of the color revolution, the regime change policy, and one of the key activists against Trump, Soros has a $760 million bet selling short, especially on the S&P 500, expecting that Trump will be impeached by the end of this year and that this will bring down the markets. So just gives you a sense of the immorality and corruption of the network to protect a system that's failed.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's incredible to see this all the shenanigans that are happening. What else is on your radar, Harley? I mean, you got the whole situation in Europe. What else is happening in the Middle East, Russia, and also, we see some tensions in the Korean Peninsula still happening, where Kim Jong Un on a weekly basis is shooting all sorts of contraptions and projectiles into the ocean, harming sea life and putting at risk the coral reefs and the whales that happen to be swimming around there.
I'll tell you, the hot spots exist, but the most important thing is that the U.S. military reported yesterday that there's the highest level of cooperation between the US and Russian militaries in Syria and Iraq now than ever before. And the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu said the same thing. He said that we now have an appreciation of what each other is intending to do. It's now in the open between us, and the cooperation is moving ahead.
Hmm.
Now, this is, of course, one of the things that was feared from the beginning, that Trump would actually take seriously his campaign pledge to work with Putin against the terrorists.
Yep.
So I think the Syrian situation also was reported today that Syrian troops recaptured the border area between Syria and Jordan, which had been a staging area of the ISIS forces with the protection of Israel. So the Syrian victory there is significant. You don't hear a whole lot anymore about the fighting in Syria because the terrorists are on the defensive and they're being crushed by the Syrian army backed by the Russians and also the Iranians and Hezbollah. So you have a potential
Yep.
change situation in the Middle East. And then Trump, whatever else was promised or pledged, I mean, I don't like the fact that we're providing more weapons to the Saudis. On the other hand, let's say he's serious about telling the Saudis no more support for terrorism. What's going to happen when it becomes more clear that if the Saudis don't support the terrorists in Syria, they collapse? I mean, it's obvious that the Saudis have played the leading role in this. So, we'll see what happens on this thing. But I think the more important thing is the dynamic of the last couple of months. Trump talking to Putin, Trump working with the Chinese president on the Korean Peninsula, the American representative at the Beijing conference setting up an American Belt and Road Working Group to bring American companies into cooperation on the New Silk Road. All of these things reflect what Lyndon and Helga LaRouche have been working on for years, what our organization has been attempting to pull together.
Yeah.
The one thing that just irritates me is reading people who, I guess I'll use the Trump word, people who are losers, who say that this is just another move by the Rothschilds to control things. And this comes from people who have not really been fighting the Rothschilds. They wave around the anti-Rothschild flag, but when you have an actual opportunity to destroy the paradigm of the speculators and the swindlers and the funny money guys, they're retreating into objectivity, saying, well, this is just another scam, just another way of keeping the system going. Well, I would have to say to them, all you have to do is look at what Brennan has been doing, look at what Comey was doing, look at what Clapper's doing, look at what the deep state is doing to sink Trump. Is Trump the greatest guy in the world? No, he's
No.
not. But he does have a certain sense that the existing paradigm doesn't function. And therefore, he brought around him people who know more than he does,
Hmm.
trying to move to bring to an end to this paradigm.
Right.
So I think people who are these highly educated cynics do themselves and anyone who listens to them a great disservice by not investigating what actually is happening with this Belt and Road project and the potential it has to create a financial system which is not dependent on private central banks and funny money.
Yeah. Yep.
So to me, that's the lead development, that we have the beginnings of a new system. And the fact that it comes from China and Russia, well, that's kind of interesting. But if you understand history, the Russians were allies of the United States from the time of our founding. Catherine the Great was one of the initiators of the League of Armed Neutrality, which was a way of trying to keep the British or protect the emergence of a new nation from the British Empire. So we've been allies with Russia more during our history than we've been enemies.
Yeah. Exactly. And isn't there a connection between the Russians and how they helped us during the Civil War
Oh yeah,
at that
same
time?
kind of thing happened. That Alexander the Second, I believe, was the czar at the time, and shortly after Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, Alexander the Second freed the serfs of Russia. But during the Civil War, when the British were going to launch a blockade of American ports, the northern ports, the Russians sent their navy into New York and into San Francisco to try to keep the ports open. And so here you have the Brits, who are supposedly the great free trade advocates, who are trying to shut down the North by using blockades and so on. And the Russians intervened on behalf of the North, of the American government, the American people, against the British, who were major supporters of the Confederacy because they wanted to break apart the United States. There's a letter from the British Foreign Minister Palmerston at the time from January 1861 to Queen Victoria, saying the election of Lincoln may finally allow us to take back our colonies.
Mm,
That was the British plan. Let the United States be broken apart in a civil war, split on the issue of slavery, on the issue of so-called states' rights, but to use that to reestablish British control, at least over the South, as a resource for cheap cotton and cheap labor.
mm, mm.
So you had the Russians who intervened on behalf of the Americans in that war. So I think it's important for people to know the history and to realize that also World War II, look, Stalin, was he a good guy? Of course not. But the Russians bore the brunt of the Nazi war, while the British were keeping us from launching a second front.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Let me ask you a question, Harley. Do you think the British still have those colonial dreams?
Well, if you ever take a look at the reports from the conferences of the Commonwealth of Nations,
Hmm.
last time I looked, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are 50 something countries that are part of the British Commonwealth.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, they still have those dreams. And basically, it's no longer that the British Navy rules the waves, but British finance. The unregulated or deregulated trade zones and Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man and all the locations where the British have banking operations. You know, the Cayman Islands, where one three-story building has something like 3,700 corporations registered in it.
Right.
You know, they've been using this for money laundering. The Brits have played a role in international drug trafficking and drug money laundering going back to
Mm.
the Opium Wars against China.
Right.
That's never changed. Look at Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. They changed the name to HSBC, but U.S. authorities have caught them half a dozen times in the last 5 years, laundering billions of dollars of drug money, and they're given some fines and allowed to continue. So I think that certainly the imperial ambitions have changed a little bit, but the sense that British intelligence has the upper hand in the American British relationship. And it's interesting. One of the ways to get a sense of this, and it's from a slightly cynical standpoint, but read the novels of John le Carre.
Hmm.
Le Carre, who was the great spy novelist of the Cold War, has done a whole series of new novels recently on and drug and gun running. And what does he talk about? He talks about British aristocrats who were at the center of the operations with their ties through their college chums in British intelligence. Look at the role of the GCHQ in working and providing false leads to the FBI and the CIA on the so-called Trump-Russia collusion. I find it ironic that the British are now critical of the United States for so-called leaks around Manchester, when look at all the leaks that were the basis of the so-called investigation into Trump's Russia problem.
Yeah,
Most of them came from Great Britain.
real.
So the form of empire has changed, but I think the intent to control the system and to control the process still is there.
Well, you got, the Canadian prime ministers, Australian prime ministers, New Zealand prime ministers, and everybody in the Commonwealth. They're all pledged fealty to the Queen, and whenever they're sworn into office, it's the craziest thing in the world.
Yeah. And I
You
think
know,
also you look at the problems that China is having with India. Although there are some very good things about what Modi has done, I think you run up against the old British Commonwealth and British Raj traditions
right?
that affect the Indians and make them susceptible to this anti-China line that's coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's ridiculous to see that. I mean, the last BRICS conference that they had, or I'm sorry, the last meeting they had with the New Silk Road, the One Belt One Road meeting, India abstained themselves. They're like, well, we're kind of mad because China's putting pipelines through Pakistan.
Yeah,
Well, China stabilizing, if left alone and left on its natural course, the tensions between India and Pakistan would be neutralized and stabilized by China because of a common economically and mutually beneficial agreement amongst all three parties. But of course, the Brits can't let that happen, or the Anglo-American power structure cannot let that happen. So they're going to have to put their shivs in any place possible. Anything from floating trade deals with the Indians to military equipment. I mean, whatever they can. So I'm seeing definitely that they're doing their part to slow things down.
well, you're absolutely right. And if you look at it, the Cold War formula was that it was India and Russia against Pakistan and China. Now, the old Cold War mentality of dividing East and West and North and South still dominates the thinking of the geopoliticians in the Western governments.
Hmm.
And to the extent that they have co thinkers in the developing sector countries, that becomes a problem. On the other hand, if the Chinese are successful in convincing people like Modi that this is the best thing going, then you end the divisions that were there from the Cold War.
Right.
That's also why I say that I'm willing to give Trump a little bit of wiggle room on the Middle East. Again, his kissing up to the Saudis rankles me. I think Roger Stone was quoted saying it made him nauseous to see Trump do the same dance with the Saudis that George W. Bush did.
Sure.
On the other hand, the effort to try to force the pro jihadist regimes to put them under pressure to break with the policy of supporting terrorism, maybe it'll have an impact. Especially, I'm told that his talks with Netanyahu and Abbas were fairly tough in that he expects them to sit down and actually begin negotiating. So I'm writing an article today on the solution to the Mideast peace rests with the One Belt, One Road. There's a major effort by the Chinese now to work with Qatar and Dubai and some of these uh, rich Middle Eastern countries that instead of just building skyscrapers and resorts, could really do a lot of good for the connection between Asia and Africa, for example. So this is why, again, the anger against what the Chinese are doing, coming from the British-oriented circles, their whole game is predicated on keeping these countries at odds, keeping geopolitical confrontation. If you break that, then the power of these transatlantic elites is finished. And so I
Right.
think this is what we're working on. This is what I'm looking at as the potential. And I hope your listeners are following these developments. You can go to larouchepack.com and get a good reading on it on any given day of what's happening with it. But it's a very rough situation because the world is so screwed up and has been so screwed up for 40 years of funny money and floating exchange rates and so-called free trade agreements and so on. It takes a little while to put things back together.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Harley, your closing statements, man, and how they people could follow you and your works.
Well, I think the most important thing is we got to keep our eyes on the big picture. Now,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean we ignore the little things that are going on. And by little things, I mean the things like the Manchester terror operation or the Obama Merkel love fest. And we got to keep really clear vision on what our enemies are doing. Also, by the way, the Federal Reserve meeting with this whole idea that the US is really in a strong economic position and now we can start raising rates, ignoring reports from the IMF, the OECD, and even a report in the Federal Reserve,
Hmm.
which says that raising US interest rates could risk bankrupting one fourth to one fifth of US corporations. So that doesn't sound so strong to me. So we
Hmm.
got to keep an eye on those things. But I think the most important thing is be part of this strategic realignment and recognize that it's not a question of supporting Trump, it's a question of supporting your own future.
Absolutely. 1000%. Very well said. It's not a question about supporting Trump or any political party. It's about supporting your very future. Very well said, man. Very well said.
And keep an eye on the traitors in both parties because there are plenty of them.
Hmm. Dime a dozen, man. It's a pit of vipers over there in DC. A pit of vipers. With that being said, folks, thank you all for listening in. This concludes another episode of Hanging with Harley. Check back again with us next week. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you will be alerted to the next time this program is on and available. Uh, Thank you all for listening in and have a great week. Take it away, CJ.